Welcome back to Sunday Nation. As we look at Martin Luther King Jr., one aspect that is missing, that is hardly emphasized, is his quest for economic justice. I wrote in my column this week in the Detroit News. You can read my columns on Mondays and Thursdays. This week's column, I talked about Martin Luther King Jr. and the question of economic justice and what is presently going on in Detroit. The project, the $1.5 billion hotel project being undertaken by the billionaire empires of Chris Ilitch and Stephen Ross, now requesting almost $800 million in taxpayer incentives to carry out that project undertaken by billionaires Stephen Ross and Chris Ilitch. I talked about what Martin Luther King Jr. would do. Dr. King, as we reflect on him, we know. He talked about this nation having socialism for the rich and rugged individualism for the poor. Dr. King railed against tax subsidies for the ultra-rich. He talked about the need for government to focus on those who are at the bottom of the economic scale, all of which I laid out in my column this week. Detroit seems to have forgotten the message of King and his quest for economic justice. In Detroit, there seems to be a penchant for doling away millions of taxpayer money to billionaires to build their fanciful projects and increase their wealth on Forbes' annual list of billionaires. That is inherently unfair, something that Dr. King saw through, which is why he reminded us so gallantly in his own words that this nation, I repeat, has socialism for the rich and rugged individualism for the poor. So as we reflect on Dr. King this week, think about it. What would King have said about the $1.5 billion hotel project in District Detroit that now stands to gain out of taxpayers $800 million? Obviously, Dr. King would have frowned upon that. That's a classic case of what King bemoaned as socialism for the rich and rugged individualism for the poor. Detroit needs to get back to doing what Dr. King's message was about, fighting for economic justice. It was convenient this week for Mayor Mike Duggan, some members of the Detroit City Council, to speak glowingly and admiringly about Martin Luther King Jr. and his message of economic justice. But what was missing in Mayor Mike Duggan's tribute, what was missing in the tribute that some council members were given at MLK events all across the city, was the fact that Dr. King would not have approved of the kind of taxpayer money that is getting ready, that we are on the verge of handing over to the billionaire empires of Stephen Ross and Chris Ilitch. Dr. King would challenge both Stephen Ross and Chris Ilitch to stand up and fight for the poor. Dr. King would have challenged the Detroit City Council and Mayor Mike Duggan to stand up and fight for those who are the victims of economic injustice. Martin Luther King would have challenged and called out the hypocrisy of celebrating him, lifting up, seeking to lift up his legacy, while at the same time acquiescing to the demands of the ultra-rich, who don't need public money, don't need public resources to fund their own fanciful projects. Detroit government should not be in the business of funding billionaires. Detroit government should be in the business of addressing structural inequity. That includes poverty, racism, and all the isms. That's what Detroit government should be in the business of. Not funding billionaires, not helping billionaires increase their worth on Forbes' annual list of billionaires. Think about the stinking hypocrisy of lifting up Martin Luther King in a city that knows all well about Dr. King. This was Detroit. It was in Detroit where Martin Luther King Jr. first gave the first draft of the I Have a Dream speech and March on Woodward. Oh yes, Detroit knows something. Detroit is not only a footnote in the civil rights movement. Detroit was a chapter in the national civil rights movement. The question becomes, how did Detroit fall off from being a chapter in the civil rights movement to now becoming a city that loves to fund the projects of billionaires at the expense of taxpayers? Suddenly, this latest request from the billionaire empires of Chris Ilitch and Stephen Ross, this latest request follows another request that was given, approved by taxpayers in the building of the Little Caesars Arena. Almost $320 million. $320 million, not $300, not $300,000. Almost $320 million in taxpayer money went into the creation or the erection or the building of Little Caesars Arena. And it does not stop at that. There are many other examples where Detroit, time and time again, and I laid it out in my column in the Detroit News this week, time and time again, Detroit hardly says no to those with deep pockets who could afford to independently finance their own projects. And yet, when you look at the economic inequality index in Detroit, it is shameful. This is one of the nation's poorest cities, one of the nation's poorest cities, one of the largest epicenters of inequality, one of the greatest and shameful examples of the dungeons of poverty, one of the biggest monuments to structural inequality. Despite all of these glaring challenges, instead of addressing the questions of water shutoffs, the question of homelessness, the foreclosure crisis, $600 million overtaxation of homeowners, and a host of other challenges laying at the feet of Mayor Mike Duggan and the City Council, instead of taking on those tasks, funding those issues, and bringing them to a successful resolution that would lead to the advancement, the upliftment of the lives of ordinary Detroiters, the mayor and the council have demonstrated that preference should be given to making sure that the billionaire class is taken care of. Consider this. The hotel development in District Detroit is estimated to be a $1.5 billion project. And the request of taxpayers is $800 million. That's almost half of the project. Now, if that's the case, shouldn't the public have a stake in the project? Shouldn't taxpayers have a stake in the project? If they're going to dole out this much money, and of course we've not even addressed the other issues of equity and inclusion as it relates to these billion-dollar empires. But bringing it back to Martin Luther King Jr., if Detroit truly wants to live the dream, truly wants to fulfill the message of Dr. King, truly wants to be an example of Dr. King's quest for economic justice, bridging the gap, the gulf between the rich and poor, Detroit could this week say no to $800 million request from the billionaires. Detroit could say no on the authority of Martin Luther King Jr. But the leadership of City Hall is not courageous enough or bold enough to say no to the billionaire class. But they are courageous and bold enough to say no to the powerless, the helpless, and the ordinary. It makes no sense, and it is shameful. We'll be right back with more on Sunday Nation.